Hello family, welcome to Kelly Stories. Please subscribe and leave a like for us, it means the world to us. Also, share this video with your friends and loved ones, and turn on post notifications so you don't miss future videos from us. Thank you. As you do so, sit back and relax as we dive into the story. The grand opening of Premier Hotel's latest luxury location shimmered with elegance and excess. Towering chandeliers bathed the marble floor in a golden glow, and the sounds of a live jazz band danced through the expansive ballroom. Waitstaff, dressed in crisp black and white uniforms, weaved seamlessly between guests, offering trays of champagne and delicate hors d'oeuvres. Among them was Sarah Evans, carefully balancing a silver tray as she maneuvered through the crowd. This was her third event shift this week, and exhaustion weighed on her feet, but the overtime pay was necessary. Raising two young boys alone didn't leave room for rest. Sarah kept her head down, dodging the flirtatious comments from guests and the occasional rude remark, as if invisible. The catering uniform, too tight at the waist, made her feel anything but glamorous in a room filled with designer gowns and tailored suits. At the center of the event, John Premier, the man of the hour, held court, flanked by business associates. He smiled for photographers, exuding the confidence of someone accustomed to success. Premier Hotels was his empire, and tonight, this new addition to his collection symbolized another milestone. As the evening progressed, John wandered through the ballroom, personally greeting guests. When his eyes landed on Sarah, something about her caught his attention. She stood by the bar, delicately arranging drinks on a tray. John wasn't the type to be drawn in easily, but there was a softness in her profile, a quiet resilience that intrigued him. He approached casually, striking up small talk. Sarah met his gaze, surprised by his directness. She responded politely but cautiously, aware of the divide between their worlds. As the night wore on, John found excuses to stay near Sarah, impressed by her humility and quick wit. One moment led to another, a shared glass of champagne after her shift, laughter in the quiet corners of the hotel. Sarah hadn't intended for anything to happen, but the chemistry between them was undeniable. By the time they found themselves in his suite, the lines between impulse and loneliness blurred in the soft glow of city lights pouring through the window. Sarah forgot the weight of her struggles, if only for that night. But as dawn crept in, reality resurfaced. Before John woke, Sarah slipped away, leaving nothing but the faint scent of her perfume and the lingering warmth of the night behind her. Sarah sat on the edge of the bathtub, staring at the pregnancy test resting on the sink, two pink lines, bright, unmistakable, and life-altering. Her hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the cold porcelain, struggling to process what lay ahead. The room felt smaller, the weight of her new reality pressing down on her. Memories of that night at the Premier Hotel flooded back, the charm in John's smile, the way his eyes lingered, and the brief escape she allowed herself. But that was supposed to be it, a fleeting moment, not the start of something permanent. She couldn't call him, their lives had intersected for a single evening. Reaching out now felt impossible. What could she even say? Surprise, you're going to be a father to twins? The thought alone made her chest tighten. Days passed, but the dread never eased. Sarah worked double shifts, hoping the fatigue would drown out her thoughts, but no matter how many hours she logged, her mind circled back to the test hidden at the back of her drawer. Her closest friend and co-worker, Comfort, noticed the change. "You've been quiet lately," she nudged one evening as they wiped down tables after closing. Sarah hesitated, biting her lip before finally admitting the truth. Comfort's eyes widened, but she squeezed Sarah's hand with quiet reassurance. "You've handled worse," she said gently. Sarah nodded, but doubt lingered. Her life was already a balancing act, juggling rent, bills, and barely affording daycare. Adding two infants to the mix felt like an insurmountable climb. Yet, deep down, she knew she wouldn't take the easy way out. These babies were hers, and she'd fight to give them the life they deserved. That night, Sarah lay awake, one hand resting over her stomach. The faintest flutter of protectiveness stirred within her, a connection forming long before she'd even met them. She whispered promises to the empty room, vowing to protect them, love them, and never let them feel like a mistake. There was fear, yes, but also a quiet resolve growing stronger with each passing moment. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Sarah wouldn't let this define her as a victim. She'd raise these children on her own terms, even if the path forward felt uncertain and lonely. Sarah's tiny apartment barely contained the chaos that came with newborn twins. Ezekiel and Caleb arrived early, fragile and small, spending their first few weeks in the NICU. The medical bills piled up faster than she could count, leaving her nights filled with tears and exhaustion. Nights blurred into mornings as she juggled diaper changes, feedings, and colic that seemed never-ending. Sleep became a luxury, and her body ached from constantly holding one twin while trying to comfort the other. Sometimes, both boys cried for hours in unison, overwhelming her to the point where she sat on the kitchen floor, crying with them. There was no one to call for help, family wasn't an option, her parents had passed, and her brother lived out of state with a family of his own. This was her fight alone. Her days were no easier. Sarah took on as many catering gigs as she could, leaving the twins with an elderly neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, who helped out for minimal pay. Every dollar earned stretched thinner by the week. Sarah became adept at making one pack of diapers last, cutting corners where she could. When Mrs. Peterson fell ill, Sarah had no choice but to bring the twins to a catering job, strapping them into a double stroller tucked behind the kitchen door. Her boss, though sympathetic, warned it could happen again. Sarah left that night in tears, wondering how much longer she could keep this up. Every decision felt like walking a tightrope, each mistake threatening to unravel the fragile stability she had built. Yet, in the rare quiet moments, Sarah found strength. When Ezekiel gripped her finger with his tiny hand or when Caleb's sleepy eyes followed her around the room, she felt purpose. She wasn't just working to survive, she was working for them. The weight of responsibility became a fuel that pushed her to continue, even when it seemed impossible. The exhaustion, the endless bills, and the sleepless nights were nothing compared to the love she held for her boys. As challenging as motherhood had become, Sarah clung to the belief that one day they would look at her and know she had given them everything she could. The Premier Hotel shimmered with the same glow it had 5 years ago, though for Sarah, stepping through its polished doors felt like entering another life. This time, she wasn't here as a guest of the owner's attention, but as part of the catering staff. Ezekiel and Caleb were now 5, and she balanced raising them while working multiple jobs to keep them clothed and fed. The Premier Hotel's events paid well, and Sarah couldn't afford to turn down shifts. Dressed in her usual catering uniform, she kept her head down, arranging silverware and folding napkins with practiced ease. The room bustled with activity, but her goal was simple. Finish the shift, collect her paycheck, and return home to her boys. But fate had other plans. As Sarah maneuvered through the crowd, she caught sight of a familiar figure across the room, John Premier. Time had been kind to him, his tailored suit fit perfectly, his presence still commanding as he laughed with guests and gave interviews to reporters covering the hotel expansion. Sarah froze, her stomach twisting in knots. She hadn't expected to see him again, certainly not like this. Her hands trembled as she turned to slip away, but it was too late. John's gaze drifted across the room and landed on her, his eyes narrowed, recognition flickering behind them as his easy smile faltered. John excused himself from his conversation and crossed the room in long strides. Sarah, his voice was filled with disbelief, his expression unreadable. Sarah straightened, masking her panic with calm indifference. "Mr. Premier," she replied, keeping her tone professional. John's gaze shifted, and before Sarah could guide him away, his attention locked onto Ezekiel and Caleb, the twins seated quietly in the corner, mirrored his every feature. The resemblance was striking, impossible to ignore. John's eyes widened in shock, realization dawning. "Are those," he began, but Sarah cut him off swiftly. "It's a long story," she said tightly. She braced herself for the confrontation she had long dreaded, knowing there was no running this time. Sarah's heart pounded as John's gaze flicked back and forth between her and the twins, the questions hanging on his lips visible in his furrowed brow, but she refused to let panic show. With a deep breath, she straightened her posture, forcing herself to meet his eyes without wavering. "Yes, they're yours," she admitted, her voice calm but edged with weariness. John blinked as if the words hadn't registered. He took a step closer, lowering his voice, though the disbelief cracked through. Mine? His eyes softened as he glanced over at Ezekiel and Caleb, who were now fiddling with their toy cars, oblivious to the weight of the moment unraveling around them. Sarah felt the invisible wall she built for 5 years begin to crack. She wasn't ready for this confrontation. "I didn't think I'd ever see you again," she said flatly, trying to keep the tremor from her voice. "And I didn't think you'd want to know," she added. John's head snapped toward her, his expression tightening. "You didn't think I'd want to know I have children?" His voice rose slightly, but he reined it in, careful not to draw attention. Sarah crossed her arms defensively, holding her ground. "I didn't have the luxury of guessing how you'd feel. I did what I had to do for them." She cast a glance toward the twins, her heart aching under the weight of her decision. John's shoulders sank, the anger giving way to something else, guilt, confusion, regret. "I would have been there," he whispered, though even he seemed unsure of his own words. Sarah wasn't convinced. "Maybe. But I couldn't take that risk." The silence between them thickened, but John's eyes didn't leave the twins. For the first time in 5 years, Sarah let him stand there, watching his sons without pulling away, even as unease churned in her stomach. She knew this was only the beginning of a much larger conversation. John barely slept that night. His mind looped around the sight of Ezekiel and Caleb, his sons, playing quietly in that corner of the hotel. Their resemblance to him was undeniable, and the weight of their existence gnawed at him like an ache he couldn't shake. He replayed every word Sarah had said, dissecting the coldness in her tone, the defiance in her eyes. He couldn't blame her for the anger or for keeping the truth hidden, but that didn't make it easier to swallow. The next morning, John showed up at the small diner where Sarah worked part-time. He waited until the lunch rush died down, catching her by the counter as she refilled a coffee pot. "Sarah, I need to be part of their lives," he said without preamble. She didn't look up immediately, her hand steady as she poured. "I'm not stopping you from knowing them, John, but there are limits." Finally, she met his gaze, her eyes colder than the previous night. "You don't get to walk in and disrupt everything. They don't know who you are. I'm not going to confuse them because you suddenly feel guilty." John leaned forward, lowering his voice. "I'm not here out of guilt. I want to know them. I have a right to." Sarah's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, she looked as if she might throw the entire pot of coffee at him. "You forfeited that right the second you disappeared," she snapped. John's jaw tightened, but he restrained himself. "I didn't disappear. I didn't even know," he replied softly, sincerity edging his tone. "Exactly," Sarah shot back, "and now, after all these years, I've built something stable for them. I won't have you undo it. If you want to be involved, you'll do it on my terms." John nodded slowly, accepting the small sliver she was offering, knowing full well she wasn't ready to let him in completely. For now, the door remained only slightly ajar. John began showing up regularly at the diner, not to force Sarah's hand but simply to observe from a distance. He'd take a corner booth, nursing a cup of coffee for far longer than necessary, just to watch Sarah work. On weekends, he'd spot the twins darting in and out of the kitchen, bringing smiles to the waitstaff who had clearly grown attached to them. Though he wasn't part of their world yet, John felt the pull more intensely with each visit. He couldn't shake the desire to know them, to fill the gaps he'd missed. Without telling Sarah, John began paying off small things, outstanding daycare fees, overdue electric bills, even the rent she'd fallen behind on. When Sarah caught wind of it, she stormed over to his table one afternoon, hands on her hips, her apron still tied around her waist. "Stop it," she hissed, voice low to avoid a scene. John arched a brow. "Stop what?" he asked innocently. "I don't need your charity," Sarah grounded out. "I don't need you swooping in like some knight trying to fix everything with money." John placed his cup down gently and met her eyes, his tone soft but firm. "I'm not doing this for you, Sarah. I'm doing it for them. You can be angry with me, but don't take it out on the boys." For a brief second, she wavered, the fire in her eyes dimming just slightly, but as quickly as it came, it passed, and she stepped back, shaking her head. If you want to help, find another way. They need more than money. John watched her walk away, the truth of her words settling uncomfortably in his chest. He wasn't sure what it would take to break down her walls, but he knew he couldn't stop trying. Ezekiel and Caleb were smart, smarter than Sarah sometimes gave them credit for. The more John appeared at the diner, the more questions they began to ask. "Mom, why does that man always sit there?" Ezekiel asked one afternoon, balancing on the edge of the counter as he watched John from afar. Sarah froze momentarily as she packed leftover pastries into a box, her back turned to the twins. "He's just a customer," she replied casually, but Ezekiel's curious stare didn't waver. Caleb, always the quieter one, tugged on Ezekiel's sleeve. "He smiles at us a lot," Caleb added, chewing on the end of his thumb thoughtfully. Sarah's grip tightened around the pastry box, though she didn't turn around. Ezekiel tilted his head as if trying to piece together a puzzle. At 5 years old, he wasn't yet capable of connecting the dots fully, but he sensed something more. "He looks like us," Ezekiel whispered to Caleb, loud enough for Sarah to hear. Her chest tightened at the observation. She had done her best to keep the twins from questioning the absence of a father, and up until now, they had never pushed too hard. But John's presence was stirring things she had fought to keep dormant. Sarah glanced over her shoulder at the two of them and forced a smile. "A lot of people might look like you," she said softly, tousling Ezekiel's hair in an attempt to redirect his focus. "On your drawings, okay?" But even as they nodded and returned to their coloring books, Sarah felt their gazes drift back to John across the diner. John met her eyes briefly, his expression unreadable. She could sense his longing, but she wasn't ready to open that door, not yet. She prayed the boys wouldn't notice the cracks forming in her resolve. John's patience surprised even him. In the past, when he wanted something, he made it happen swiftly, using charm, money, or sheer willpower. But Sarah wasn't a business deal, and neither were Ezekiel and Caleb. This required something more, something he hadn't exercised in years. So, instead of pushing harder, John found ways to integrate himself naturally into their lives. He started volunteering at the daycare the twins attended on weekends. At first, Sarah's disapproval was palpable. She had cornered him in the hallway on his second day, crossing her arms tightly. "This isn't a way in, John. I told you, don't confuse them," she warned. "I'm not here to confuse them," John replied evenly, crouching to tie Caleb's loose shoelace. Caleb grinned at him, oblivious to the tension. "I'm just trying to be present." Sarah watched him carefully, but something in his steady tone gave her pause. She didn't press further, though her eyes never strayed far from him whenever he was around the boys. Ezekiel, on the other hand, had started gravitating toward John naturally. The boy's admiration was subtle but unmistakable, lingering glances, shy smiles, and excitement when John arrived at the daycare. John didn't rush to claim a title or force explanations. Instead, he let the moments come quietly, helping Ezekiel with art projects, teaching Caleb how to balance on the jungle gym. And slowly, Sarah's resistance softened, though she rarely voiced it. She saw the way the boys thrived around John. It was harder to deny that he brought something they had missed, even if she hated admitting it. John wasn't asking for overnight forgiveness, and perhaps that was the only reason she let him stay. It was the annual Father's Day event at the daycare when Ezekiel made the first real connection. The room buzzed with excitement as children ushered in their fathers, each one holding handmade cards or clumsily wrapped presents. Sarah sat quietly in the back, watching from the corner with the other mothers who were playing dual roles. Ezekiel sat beside Caleb, card in hand, but his eyes kept drifting to John, who stood nearby speaking to one of the teachers. "Do you think he'd stay if we asked him?" Ezekiel whispered to Caleb, his small hands fidgeting nervously with the edges of the paper. Caleb shrugged, more interested in the cupcakes on the snack table. Finally, Ezekiel gathered his courage and walked toward John. Sarah's breath caught as she watched the scene unfold, unsure whether to step in. "Mr. John," Ezekiel said shyly, holding out the small card with uneven handwriting that read Happy Father's Day. John crouched down to meet him at eye level, his heart swelling as he accepted the card. "This for me?" John asked softly, glancing at Sarah who stood frozen in the corner. Ezekiel nodded. "You're here a lot. I thought maybe you could stay," the boy explained simply. John's throat tightened at the innocence behind the gesture. He smiled and ruffled Ezekiel's hair. "I'd love to stay," he said, his voice cracking slightly. Sarah looked away, blinking rapidly to compose herself. She hadn't expected this. As John joined the boys at the crafts table, she realized that despite her best efforts to keep him at arm's length, the cracks in her fences were beginning to grow. Perhaps, just perhaps, there was room for more. A week after the Father's Day event, Sarah's world narrowed to the four walls of her small apartment when Caleb fell ill. It started with a mild fever, but by nightfall, his temperature spiked dangerously high. Sarah sat by his bed, wiping his forehead with a cool cloth while Ezekiel quietly colored at the kitchen table. Her heart clenched every time Caleb whimpered in his sleep. The weight of single parenthood bore down heavily in moments like these. She had no one to turn to, no backup plan, no support system other than herself. As the clock ticked past midnight, Caleb's breathing grew more labored, and panic began to creep into her chest. Desperation made her swallow her pride. Sarah grabbed her phone and, after hesitating, called John. She hated involving him, but Caleb's health mattered more than her stubbornness. John answered on the first ring, his voice alert despite the late hour. "I'll be there in 10, he said without question. True to his word, John arrived shortly after, carrying a small bag of over-the-counter medication. Sarah opened the door, arms crossed but eyes weary. "I didn't know who else to call," she admitted. Stepping aside. John didn't gloat or question her decision. He knelt by Caleb's bedside, gently brushing hair from the boy's damp forehead. "You did the right thing," he murmured, his tone soft but reassuring. For the next few hours, John stayed by Caleb's side, holding his hand and humming softly until the boy's fever began to break. Sarah watched quietly from the doorway, arms wrapped around herself. There was something about the way John cared for their son that made her stomach twist, not in anger but in guilt. Maybe she had been too harsh. Maybe, for the first time, she was starting to see him not just as the man who left, but as someone who wanted to stay. The next day, Sarah returned to the diner, blurry-eyed but grateful that Caleb's fever had subsided. John had offered to pick up groceries for her, an offer she begrudgingly accepted. As Sarah wiped down tables during the lunch rush, Vanessa Premier, the last person she wanted to see, strode in like she owned the place. Heads turned as Vanessa's expensive heels clicked against the floor, and Sarah's heart sank. Vanessa had always carried herself like royalty, and today was no different, with perfectly curled hair and a smug smile. She sauntered toward Sarah with deliberate purpose. "Well, if it isn't the mystery woman," Vanessa said, her eyes scanning Sarah dismissively. "I wondered how long it would take before you resurfaced." Sarah stiffened, tightening her grip on the cleaning cloth. "I'm working. If you need something, ask another waitress," Sarah replied coldly, hoping Vanessa would lose interest. But Vanessa wasn't one to let things go easily. "You think showing up with twins will secure you a piece of John's wealth?" she sneered, lowering her voice. "I've seen this before, women crawling out of the woodwork once they realize who they've slept with." Sarah's face flushed with anger, but she bit her tongue. "I don't need his money," she hissed, glaring at Vanessa. "I'm raising them just fine on my own." Vanessa's smile sharpened, but before she could retort, John entered the diner. His gaze shifted between the two women, his expression darkening. "Vanessa, leave," John said firmly, stepping between them. "You have no right to come here." Vanessa's eyes narrowed, but she eventually backed off, giving Sarah one last pointed glare before exiting. John turned to Sarah, an apology in his eyes. "I'm sorry." "She won't bother you again," he promised. Sarah exhaled slowly, her defenses rising once more. John may have stepped in, but trouble seemed to follow wherever he went. Later that week, Ezekiel's natural curiosity began to bloom into full-blown suspicion. He had seen the interaction between his mother and Vanessa, and the confrontation left lingering questions in his young mind. That evening, as Sarah tucked him into bed, Ezekiel clutched his stuffed dinosaur and stared at her with wide, searching eyes. "Mom," he began hesitantly, "why did that lady say stuff about Mr. John today?" Sarah froze, smoothing the blanket unnecessarily. "She was just being mean," she answered softly, brushing his curls from his forehead. "Don't worry about it." But Ezekiel wasn't satisfied. "She said something about us," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah swallowed hard, trying to formulate a careful response, but Ezekiel pressed on. "Is Mr. John our dad?" The question hung heavily in the room, and Sarah felt her throat tighten. Ezekiel's innocent gaze was unwavering, and she realized he wouldn't accept another vague excuse. With a sigh, Sarah sat on the edge of his bed and took his small hand in hers. "Yes," she admitted softly. "Mr. John is your father." Ezekiel's eyes widened in surprise, and he shifted in bed, processing the revelation. "Why didn't he live with us?" Ezekiel's voice trembled slightly, and Sarah squeezed his hand gently. "Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes," she explained carefully. "But he's here now. He wants to know you and Caleb, and I think he's trying really hard to make up for not being here before." Ezekiel was quiet for a long moment before finally nodding. "I like him," he said simply. Sarah's heart clenched as she kissed his forehead. "I know," she whispered. As she left his room and leaned against the closed door, she realized there was no going back. Ezekiel's questions would only grow, and it was up to John to prove he was ready for the role. The next morning, Sarah woke to the sound of giggles coming from the living room. As she entered, she found Ezekiel and Caleb sitting cross-legged on the carpet, stacking blocks. The innocence of the moment made her smile, but Ezekiel's curious gaze shifted toward her as she poured their cereal. "Mom," he began cautiously, stirring his spoon, "why didn't Mr. John know about us before?" The question was inevitable, yet Sarah felt the weight of it settle heavily on her shoulders. She sat beside them, taking a deep breath. Caleb, younger and more easily distracted, continued building his tower, but Ezekiel's eyes never wavered. Sarah placed her hand over Ezekiel's. "I thought I was doing the right thing," she said gently. "When I found out I was going to have you and Caleb, I didn't know how to tell him. I was scared, and sometimes adults think they're protecting their children by keeping things simple." Her voice softened as she tucked a loose curl behind his ear. "But I realized now that keeping secrets wasn't fair to you or Mr. John." Ezekiel processed her words quietly, his brow furrowed in thought. "Does that mean he's going to live with us now?" he asked, his voice tinged with both hope and uncertainty. Sarah's heart tightened. "No, sweetheart," she replied, pulling him into a hug. "But he'll be around more. He wants to be part of your lives, and I think that's a good thing." Ezekiel nodded slowly, as if accepting this new reality piece by piece. Caleb finally looked up from his tower and smiled, oblivious to the deeper meaning of the conversation. Sarah kissed both of their foreheads, silently hoping John could live up to their growing expectations. Later that week, John unexpectedly arrived at the daycare, 2 small bicycles strapped to the back of his truck. Sarah watched from the entrance, arms crossed, her expression unreadable as he unloaded them. "I thought they could use some bikes," John explained, a nervous edge in his voice as he caught Sarah's cautious stare. Ezekiel and Caleb ran toward the bikes with wide eyes, instantly drawn to the bright red frames and training wheels. "Is this okay?" John asked quietly, noticing Sarah's hesitation. She exhaled, her gaze softening as she watched the boys inspect their gifts. "It's thoughtful," she admitted, though her pride made the words feel heavy on her tongue. Ezekiel clapped his hands excitedly, tugging at John's sleeve. "Can you teach me to ride it?" he asked eagerly. John smiled, kneeling to Ezekiel's level. "Of course, buddy," he replied. Caleb clung to Sarah's leg, peering shyly at his new bike. "You can ride with me," John added gently, patting Caleb's head. Sarah felt her walls crumble just a little more as she watched John's patient, attentive demeanor. There was a time when she believed he wouldn't have the capacity to step up like this, but each small effort chipped away at the image she once held of him. As John adjusted the bike seat for Ezekiel, Sarah sat on the bench silently observing. Her sons deserved this, even if part of her wasn't ready to fully trust John yet. "Thank you," she finally said, her voice barely audible over the laughter of the boys. John looked up, locking eyes with her for a moment that felt significant yet fleeting. "I'm trying," he replied softly. Sarah nodded, acknowledging the sincerity in his words. Maybe, just maybe, there was room for growth for all of them. A week later, John nervously paced outside the small community center where Sarah had agreed to meet him. It was a neutral place, away from the twins, for a conversation that felt long overdue. He wanted to discuss logistics, boundaries, and how he could be more involved without overstepping. The air was tense when Sarah arrived, her expression guarded yet hopeful. "I want to do this right," John started, his voice earnest. "I know I've missed a lot, but I want to be there for them, in whatever way you'll allow." Sarah took a deep breath, the weight of their shared history pressing down on her. "We need to set some ground rules," she said, her tone firm but not unkind. "They're my priority, and I won't have them hurt because we couldn't figure this out." John nodded, ready to listen and compromise. They talked for hours, setting expectations, discussing visitation, and even touching on future possibilities. It wasn't easy, and there were moments of tension, but by the end, they had a tentative plan. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start, a path toward co-parenting that Sarah could live with. As they parted ways, there was an unspoken agreement that they were in this together now, for the sake of Ezekiel and Caleb. The journey would be challenging, but for the first time, Sarah felt they might just make it work. Sarah's apartment. His hand stuffed into his pockets, it was the first time she'd agreed to let him take the boys for the weekend, and though the opportunity thrilled him, the responsibility felt heavier than he anticipated. When Sarah finally opened the door, Ezekiel and Caleb bounded out, backpacks slung over their shoulders. "Be good for Mr. John, okay?" Sarah instructed, kneeling to their level. "I'll see you Sunday evening." The boys nodded enthusiastically, already eager to climb into John's car. As they drove to an amusement park just outside the city, John glanced in the rearview mirror, taking in their excitement. Ezekiel rattled off questions about roller coasters while Caleb quietly gazed out the window, clutching his stuffed dinosaur. John's heart swelled with pride but also anxiety. He wasn't sure how to entertain them for an entire weekend, but he knew he wanted to try. At the park, John held their hands tightly, navigating the crowds as they rode carousels, played arcade games, and devoured cotton candy. Later that night, back at John's penthouse, the boys curled up on the couch watching cartoons while John ordered pizza. As he tucked them into the guest room, Ezekiel tugged his sleeve. "I had fun today," he murmured, yawning. John smiled, brushing his hair back. "Me too, buddy." But as John returned to the living room, a strange emptiness settled over him. The joy of the day was undeniable, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing, Sarah. For the first time, he wondered if reconnecting with his children would also require reconnecting with her, not just as their mother, but as someone he had once let slip away. The following week, the twins returned to school after their weekend with John, brimming with excitement as they shared their stories with classmates. Ezekiel couldn't stop talking about the adventure, his words tumbling out faster than his thoughts. Sarah's apartment. His hand stuffed into his pockets, it was the first time she'd agreed to let him take the boys for the weekend, and though the opportunity thrilled him, the responsibility felt heavier than he anticipated. When Sarah finally opened the door, Ezekiel and Caleb bounded out, backpacks slung over their shoulders. "Be good for Mr. John, okay?" Sarah instructed, kneeling to their level. "I'll see you Sunday evening." The boys nodded enthusiastically, already eager to climb into John's car. As they drove to an amusement park just outside the city, John glanced in the rearview mirror, taking in their excitement. Ezekiel rattled off questions about roller coasters while Caleb quietly gazed out the window, clutching his stuffed dinosaur. John's heart swelled with pride but also anxiety. He wasn't sure how to entertain them for an entire weekend, but he knew he wanted to try. At the park, John held their hands tightly, navigating the crowds as they rode carousels, played arcade games, and devoured cotton candy. Later that night, back at John's penthouse, the boys curled up on the couch watching cartoons while John ordered pizza. As he tucked them into the guest room, Ezekiel tugged his sleeve. "I had fun today," he murmured, yawning. John smiled, brushing his hair back. "Me too, buddy." But as John returned to the living room, a strange emptiness settled over him. The joy of the day was undeniable, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing: Sarah. For the first time, he wondered if reconnecting with his children would also require reconnecting with her, not just as their mother, but as someone he had once let slip away. The following week, the twins returned to school after their weekend with John, brimming with excitement as they shared their stories with classmates. Ezekiel couldn't stop talking about the roller coasters and the giant stuffed bear John had won for him. Caleb, more reserved, quietly carried his memories with him, smiling at the thought of the fun they'd had. But as much as the weekend strengthened their bond, shadows from John's past began to creep in. One afternoon, Ezekiel overheard two older boys whispering during recess. "Did you hear about Ezekiel's dad?" one of them snickered. "My mom said he used to date some famous lady who threw a drink at him in a restaurant." Ezekiel didn't understand all of it, but the mockery in their voices stung. That evening, as Sarah tucked him into bed, he hesitated, his eyes searching hers. "Mom, is John a bad person?" The question caught her off guard, and she sat on the edge of the bed, smoothing his hair. "Why would you ask that?" she inquired softly, though she suspected the source. Ezekiel shrugged, avoiding her gaze. "I'll handle it," he promised, though Sarah remained wary. She had been through too much to let the boys become collateral damage in someone else's personal drama. Later that week, John arrived at the diner just as Sarah was finishing her shift. She greeted him with crossed arms and a guarded expression, already suspecting what brought him there. "I wanted to talk," he said, his voice low, "about Ezekiel's questions." Sarah nodded, gesturing for him to sit across from her in a quiet corner booth. The diner hummed with soft conversation and the clinking of silverware, but their table felt isolated, wrapped in the weight of unspoken concerns. "He's just a kid, John," Sarah began, her eyes narrowing. "He doesn't need to hear gossip about things that happened years ago." John's gaze fell to his hands, and for a moment, he appeared more vulnerable than she had ever seen him. "I know," he admitted. "I'm not proud of the things I did back then. I was reckless and I hurt people, including you." At the memory, but she let him continue. "I can't erase the past, but I'm trying to be better for them," he said. His sincerity was evident, but years of disappointment and hardship had made Sarah wary of words alone. "Trying isn't always enough," she replied softly. "The boys need stability, not promises that might break." John nodded, his eyes finally meeting hers with quiet determination. "I understand," he said, "and I know I have to earn your trust as much as theirs. I just hope I can prove that I'm not the same man I was." Sarah studied him for a long moment before exhaling. "It's not about earning trust," she murmured. "It's about showing up and staying." John left the diner that night with more hope than when he arrived, but also with the weight of knowing he still had a long road ahead. It was nearing midnight when Sarah's phone buzzed on her nightstand. Groggy and half asleep, she answered, expecting a telemarketer or wrong number. Instead, she heard Ezekiel's panicked voice, "Mom, the car stopped, and Caleb is scared." Sarah bolted upright, her heart pounding. "Where are you?" she asked, already slipping into her jacket. Ezekiel sniffled on the other end, "We're on the side of the road." "John is here, but his phone died." Relief washed over her, but only briefly. "Stay where you are, I'm coming." By the time Sarah reached them, her headlights illuminating John's car at the edge of a dark stretch of road, she was trembling with worry. John stood outside, waving her down with a flashlight while the twins sat bundled in the back seat. "The engine overheated," John explained, rubbing the back of his neck. I didn't want to risk driving them further. Sarah exhaled sharply, her frustration evident. Why didn't you call me sooner? She demanded, checking on the boys. John glanced at his dead phone and shrugged. I thought I could fix it before it became a problem. Ezekiel crawled into Sarah's arms, and she kissed his forehead, holding him tightly. Caleb followed, clutching his stuffed dinosaur. John watched quietly, recognizing the fierce protectiveness in Sarah's eyes. I'm sorry, he said again, softer this time. Sarah nodded, though she was still too shaken to say much. As she drove the boys home, John followed closely behind, determined not to let them out of his sight. That night, as Sarah tucked them into bed, she lingered by their door, realizing that for the first time, John had been the one to step up during an emergency, and that mattered more than she wanted to admit. In the days following the roadside incident, a subtle shift began to take place. John made a point to be more present, not just in the twins' lives, but in Sarah's as well. He dropped by the diner more frequently, helping the boys with homework during her late shifts or simply sitting with them while they ate. Sarah couldn't deny the difference his presence made. The twins flourished under the attention, their bond with John growing stronger with each passing day. Ezekiel had started calling John Dad. Without hesitation, while Caleb, more reserved, watched quietly but smiled brighter whenever John was near. Sarah found herself observing from a distance, arms crossed as she leaned against the diner's counter. It was strange to see John slip so naturally into a fatherly role, a role he had never been prepared for but embraced wholeheartedly. Despite the wall she had built, Sarah couldn't help but acknowledge the warmth he brought into their small, simple lives. But with that warmth came fear, the fear that this fragile progress might crumble if John decided to walk away again. Sarah had experienced too much disappointment to let hope bloom freely, but the sight of him teaching Caleb how to tie his shoes tugged at something in her heart she thought had long since withered. One evening, after the boys had fallen asleep at the booth waiting for her shift to end, Sarah sat across from John, the air between them heavy but calm. You didn't have to stay tonight, she murmured, watching as he tucked Caleb's coat under his chin. John smiled faintly, his gaze lingering on the twins. I wanted to, he replied simply. Sarah didn't argue. For the first time, she felt the cracks in her defenses beginning to widen. A week later, John approached Sarah with an unexpected proposal. They were sitting at the park, watching the twins race down the slides, laughter ringing through the crisp autumn air. I've been thinking, John began, his tone careful, what if I invest in your catering business? Sarah's eyes narrowed as she looked at him, skepticism flashing across her face. I don't need charity, she said firmly, bristling at the suggestion. John shook his head, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. It's not charity, he replied, it's a partnership. You're talented, Sarah. I've seen the way people line up at the diner just to eat the desserts you bring in. You could do more if you had the resources. Sarah opened her mouth to protest, but hesitated. Deep down, she knew he wasn't wrong. For years, she had harbored dreams of opening her own catering company, but life's responsibilities had forced her to shove those ambitions aside. Raising the twins alone had left little room for personal growth, let alone starting a business. Yet, hearing John acknowledge her talent stirred something long buried beneath her exhaustion. Still, her pride made her hesitate. Why now? She asked, searching his face for hidden motives. John met her gaze without flinching. Because I want to help you build something for yourself and for them. I missed out on too much already. Let me do this. Sarah watched. The twins playing in the distance, their laughter echoing through the park. Maybe, just maybe, accepting his help wasn't a sign of weakness but of growth. I'll think about it, she finally said, her voice softer than before. Ezekiel's 6th birthday arrived with the excitement only children could muster. The twins woke up early, bouncing on Sarah's bed until she groaned and pulled the covers over her head. By noon, the small apartment was decorated with balloons and streamers, but the highlight of the day came when John arrived, surprising the boys with a brand new bicycle. Ezekiel's eyes widened in awe, and for a moment, he stood speechless before lunging forward to hug John tightly. "Thank you, Dad," he exclaimed, the words tumbling out naturally. John froze for a second, his eyes flicking towards Sarah, who stood by the kitchen counter, watching with a mix of caution and something softer, something close to approval. The small party carried on in full swing, with Sarah's co-workers from the diner stopping by to celebrate. The boys played, opening presents and stuffing themselves with cake until exhaustion settled in. As the guests filtered out and the twins drifted to sleep on the couch, Sarah quietly began cleaning up, but John stepped in, taking the plates from her hands. "I'll handle it," he said softly. "You've done enough today." She hesitated but let him. As John worked, the atmosphere shifted into something quieter, more intimate. Sarah leaned against the doorway, watching him in the dim kitchen light. "They really love you," she said after a moment. John paused, setting down the plate he had been wiping. "I love them too," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "I know I miss so much, but I want to make up for it, even if it takes years." Sarah's heart ached at the sincerity in his words. She knew the boys deserved this, but the question remained, did she? A week after Ezekiel's birthday, John stood at Sarah's doorstep, holding an envelope. The boys were asleep, and the late evening breeze brushed through the small apartment window. Sarah, wiping her hands with a dish towel, looked at him curiously. "What's that?" she asked, leaning against the door frame. John hesitated for a brief second, then handed it to her. She unfolded the paper, her brows furrowing as she read the words. "Lease agreement?" she questioned, glancing up at him with suspicion. "I bought a small apartment in the next neighborhood," John explained, stepping further into the apartment. "It's closer to the boys' school, 3 bedrooms. I thought it might give you more space, something better for them." Sarah's lips pressed into a thin line as she folded the paper back neatly. Her chest tightened, and she fought the immediate urge to hand it back. "John, I can't accept this," she said firmly. "I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I don't want to feel like we're some charity case you're managing." John's eyes softened, and he shook his head. "It's not charity, it's for them. You deserve to have a better place, Sarah. I'm not asking for rent, this is me giving them something I should have years ago." Sarah sighed, her fingers tightening around the envelope. The weight of his words lingered between them, heavy with unspoken history. A part of her wanted to reject it outright, but the image of Ezekiel and Caleb sharing a small room every night made her reconsider. "I'll pay rent," she said finally. "Maybe not much right now, but I won't take it for free." John smiled faintly. "Deal," he replied. Just as Sarah began adjusting to the changes John brought into their lives, an unwelcome figure reappeared. Vanessa, John's ex, arrived unannounced at the diner one afternoon, dressed in designer heels and carrying an air of superiority. She strolled in, her eyes scanning the small restaurant until they landed on Sarah. "Well, this is quaint," Vanessa said, her lips curling into a smirk. Sarah set down the coffee pot she had been holding, leveling Vanessa with a calm yet cold stare. "Can I help you?" she asked, masking the irritation rising in her chest. Vanessa stepped closer, lowering her sunglasses with a flick of her manicured hand. "I came to see the woman who managed to trap John with the oldest trick in the book," she said. Smoothly, her voice dripping with condescension. Sarah crossed her arms, unimpressed. "If you're here to start trouble, you can see yourself out," Sarah replied, refusing to give her the satisfaction of reacting. Vanessa laughed lightly, leaning over the counter. "Oh, I'm not here to start trouble. I'm just making sure you know John and I have history. I doubt you can offer him what I did before." Before Sarah could respond, John walked in, his eyes immediately darkened as he took in the scene. "Vanessa," he said sharply, crossing the room in long strides. "What are you doing here?" Vanessa straightened, brushing her hair behind her shoulder. "Relax, John. I was just introducing myself to the mother of your children." John stepped protectively beside Sarah, his presence solid and unwavering. "We're done, Vanessa. Whatever you're trying to pull, it won't work. Leave Sarah and the boys alone." Vanessa's smug expression faltered. She gave Sarah one last glare before pivoting and leaving the diner in silence. Sarah exhaled slowly. "Thanks," she muttered. John met her eyes. "I'm not letting anyone mess with this," he said softly. After Vanessa's intrusion, John and Sarah found themselves sitting outside the diner, the sun dipping below the horizon. The boys were playing nearby, chasing each other under the fading light. John rested his elbows on his knees, staring at the ground thoughtfully. "I didn't expect her to show up," he admitted, shaking his head. Sarah glanced at him, the quiet hum of the street filling the space between them. "Neither did I," she replied, her voice softer now. "But I appreciate you stepping in." John looked up, meeting her gaze directly. "I meant what I said. I don't want anyone causing problems for you or the twins." His sincerity was evident, and for the first time in years, Sarah felt the weight of distrust lifting, if only slightly. "I know," she murmured, leaning back against the bench. "It's just hard to let my guard down. I spent so long doing everything alone." John nodded, understanding the depth of her words. "I get it," he said quietly. "But I'm here now. I'm not walking away." Sarah watched the twins in the distance, their laughter echoing across the small park. A flicker of warmth settled in her chest. "Maybe it's time I stop assuming the worst," she admitted with a small smile. John leaned back beside her, his shoulder brushing lightly against hers. "We've come a long way, Sarah. I don't expect everything to be perfect, but I'm willing to keep trying if you are." She didn't reply immediately, but the silence between them felt comfortable, like an old wound slowly healing. For the first time in a long while, Sarah allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could be different this time. As the weeks passed, John and Sarah's relationship began to shift. What once felt like strange co-parenting now resembled something closer to friendship. John found reasons to linger after picking up the boys, and Sarah didn't mind as much as she thought she would. Their conversation stretched longer into the evening, discussing school projects, the boys' habits, and even lighter topics like Sarah's new recipes at the diner. It wasn't a sudden shift but rather a gradual, almost imperceptible change that grew stronger with each passing day. Sarah couldn't deny the warmth that settled in her chest whenever she saw John laughing with Ezekiel and Caleb. One evening, after the boys had gone to bed, John stayed behind to help fix a leaky kitchen faucet. As Sarah handed him tools, she couldn't help but notice the quiet ease between them. "You've gotten better at this," she teased, watching as he tightened the last bolt. John chuckled. "I've been practicing," he replied. His gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than necessary. Sarah's heart skipped a beat, but she quickly dismissed the feeling. "Well, I guess I won't have to call a plumber anymore," she said with a playful smile. "Next time," she said, trying to sound light-hearted. John smiled but didn't press further. They both knew something unspoken hung between them, but neither of them dared to name it. Later that night, as Sarah lay in bed, she found herself replaying the evening in her mind. She couldn't deny the feelings that were starting to resurface, feelings she thought she had buried long ago. But the thought of opening her heart again terrified her. John had hurt her once before, and even though he was proving himself now, the scars of the past lingered. Sarah knew that if they were to take another step forward, she would need to let go of the fear that kept her guarded. John's hotel expansion plans had been in motion long before he discovered he had children. A new project in Seattle promised significant returns, and investors were eager for him to take the lead. But with each passing day spent with Ezekiel and Caleb, the idea of leaving town for months began to feel less appealing. John sat at his desk late one night, the proposal in front of him untouched. His mind kept drifting to the twins' laughter, to the way Caleb clung to his arm whenever he visited, and the pride in Ezekiel's eyes when John attended his school play. The decision weighed heavily on John. The hotel project wasn't just about profit, it was his legacy, the pinnacle of years of hard work. Yet, he found himself wondering if success would mean anything without his sons by his side. When Sarah brought the twins to visit him at his hotel one afternoon, John watched them race around the lobby, giggling as they played an impromptu game of tag. As Sarah chatted with the receptionist, John knelt down to tie Caleb's shoelaces, his heart swelling with affection. It was in that moment he realized the truth: he couldn't leave, not now, not when he was just starting to build the relationship he'd missed out on for years.